past president, senior colleagues, and young friends. Welcome everyone to this lecture meeting on ICDS overview in challenges in application. I'm really glad to see all of you here, as this is a slightly a breather time between end of August and end of September. The last lecture meeting that we had was on audit closure under the Companies Act 2013, and that turned out to be a very good session. And today also we have had 3 wonderful sessions at the society, one in Chennai, one in the afternoon, and this is the 3rd one that we are all gathered for. Many years ago, the eminent lawyer and a great citizen, a great son of India, Nani Palkhiwala said this: the tragedy of India is the tragedy of waste. Waste of national time, energy and manpower. Tens of millions of man hours crammed with intelligence and knowledge of tax gatherers, taxpayers and tax advisors are squandered every year, grappling with torrential spate of mindless amendments. The feverish activity achieves no more good than fever. These words of Mr. Palkhiwala rings true every single day of possibly every previous year and every assessment year. What he said then was not perhaps only his experience, but maybe a prediction of sorts. When I look at the Income Tax Law and the Income Tax Act and the ICDS now in particular, a lot of thoughts come to my mind. Normally as Indians, we are, the word in Sanskrit is samanvayakari. We kind of blend everything together. We bring things together. We want to see that everyone's views are taken care of. If somebody likes a certain food and another person likes a different food, we try to cook all of that to ensure that everyone is included. But when we look at the laws that we make, and today actually it is the need of the hour to harmonize all our laws. But when we look at, say, even accounting standards, we have so many now, and this is one more. From the earlier accounting standards which apply to non-corporate entities by the ICAI, we have the accounting standards under the company rules. We have now the Ind AS, and here is a new one, ICDS. Of course, for those who have to report under IFRS or IAS, those standards and that reporting still remains. The other week, we had a session with the Revenue Secretary in Mumbai, and he eloquently spoke about stability and certainty of tax laws and attracting investments in India. And friends, anyone who has any knowledge of English and having read even little of or little on the Indian Income Tax Act would perhaps not believe those words. There have been great speeches on ease of doing business. India is somewhere around 142nd. 142 is the number in the ranking. So we are sort of down there. And we have come one number down in 2005. We also have great sense of equality in our laws. Because our country is so diverse, we want, equality to be one large parameter. And therefore, when we make laws, we overlook the idea of materiality. Everything applies to everyone. Apply all to all. That has been a large hallmark of the way we make laws. There is also great love for fiction, I feel. I know we have great volumes of mythology. However, the love for fiction can match all of that in lawmaking. We have something known as the dealing fiction. A tax law draftsman who is often faced with issues of whether something is possible or not, whether something is appropriate or not, will deem something to be something else. An income of next year can be income of this year. An expense of next year could easily be deemed to be expense of the year after this. Then there is of course the love for litigation. Maybe it's the love for lawyers and professionals like chartered accountants, or maybe the love for publishers, that lawmaker drafts such laws that promote huge amount of litigation, as if litigation is embedded in our drafting. I am sure the ICDS will be a great boost to the taxable income of several professionals, the lawyers, the chartered accountants, and of course the publishers, and maybe that raise in their income and the tax on it and the service tax on it will definitely benefit the government. I would believe that the laws should be enablers, something that makes a nation achieve its overarching goal, which is enshrined in its constitution. But today, a businessman asks this question: when can I do business? When do I have the time, the mind space, and the energy to do business? Will I have the time to come out of compliance and focus on my business goals? Possibly the answer is no, and that is especially true for smaller businesses. Stephen Covey once spoke about 7 habits of highly effective people, and there's one habit which is called win-win. Some of you may have read that book. And when we read our laws, oftentimes this is what I see is win-lose. Heads I win, tails you lose. Just as he has all accountability, just as he is responsible for everything, whereas when you look at the other side, there is all the powers but very little accountability. And lastly, friends, if there was an award for drafting something very complex, litigation Rome, our lawmakers would win a Lifetime Achievement Award for this particular passion. So here are some facts about ICDS. They have come from 31st March 2015 under Section 145, Subsection 2. Of course, there are significant implications from assessment year beginning 16-17. They apply to those who follow mercantile system, and they apply only to 2 heads of income right now: profits and gains from business and income from other sources. And it also supersedes previous notification which attempted to bring about tax standards way back in January 1996. You all are perhaps familiar with the process of appointing committees. Committees who sit for many months, committees who give long reports, recommendations, asking for public comments, and then the manner of applying those recommendations and comments. In short, doing what the CBDT wants. Today we have the Indian Accounting Standards, we have the Ind AS, and now the 10 new ICDS. In 2011, the committee report recommended that such standards should enable certainty and clarity and eliminate alternative to the extent possible. However, we will hear today whether the actual accounting standards really bring about this objective. Effectively, the way the legislation is for assessment year 15-16, it seems like neither the tax accounting standard nor the ICDS apply. And I wonder whether this is by design or is by chance. Obviously, a new law throws up several questions to awaken the helpful nature of the lawmakers so that they can issue clarifications, so that FAQs can come out, like we saw one set come out just the other day. And it's something we all can look forward to. And there are some key questions remaining open which we will hear from Yogesh today, such as what will happen under presumptive taxation? What will happen if different accounting methods are followed for different sources of income? Would ICDS apply to non-residents? What will happen to the judicially settled positions? Will these ICDS lead to new round of litigation for few more decades? How do ICDS play out with the income tax rules? Because these standards have come through notification. What will happen to the taxpayer, the assessee? Who will bear this compliance cost? In our normal accounting standard, the preface speaks that when there is a question of cost and benefit, you need to consider that. But I don't think ICDS speaks that language at all. I wonder what meaning we should compute out of these ICDS, and therefore we all have gathered here. It's our great privilege that we have a speaker, none other than Mr. Yogesh A. Thar. He is currently a partner with Messrs. Bansi Mehta & Company, a leading firm of chartered accountants in Mumbai. He is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India and has a rich blend of experience in income tax and service tax. In his work experience of 30 years, he has acquired specialization in areas of corporate taxation, taxation of non-residents and foreign companies, business mergers, acquisitions and restructuring, and business valuations. He has to his credit authorship of several books and articles on direct tax and double taxation avoidance agreements published mainly by Taxmen, the Chamber of Tax Consultants and by the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society. His recent contribution is a book on domestic transfer pricing published by CCH, which he has co-authored with his partner, Ms. Anjali Agrawal. He was a visiting faculty at NM College. He has served as the joint editor of Bombay Chartered Accountants Society's publication, The Referencer, Count Diary, since 1997 till 2008. Mr. Thar was a member of Managing Committee of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal Bar Association at Mumbai during 2010 and 2011 and is presently a member of the Taxation Committee of the BCS. Our friends, I'll request Vice President Chetan Shah to present a memento on our behalf as our mark of appreciation and regard for Yogesh. Yogesh.
I agree with what Mr. President just said. The ICDS is going to bring a lot of benefits for all of us. Probably that means that we are still living in ancient era, that we need to dig up pits or holes for generating employment, so that somebody can fill and earn its living out of it. And Mr. President also talked about litigation, and definitely I, as practitioner, actively practicing in the area of litigation, am very, very happy about this particular piece of legislation, because last 15 years, from 2000, 2001 onwards, we have made a living out of provisions like 14K, we have made a living out of transfer pricing provisions. And another 10-15 years are further safe because of ICDS and maybe a few other things that we will see in the coming years. So let us look at what is ICDS. We have section 145(1) in the Income Tax Act, which says that the income which is chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or other sources shall be computed having regard to the method of accounting regularly followed by the SSA, subject to the provisions of 145(2). And we have 145(2) which says, or which empowers central government to notify income computation and disclosure standards. So, pursuant to this power, the CBDT has, by notification of March 15, introduced 10 ICDS, which will be effective from 1st April 15 and accordingly will apply to assessment years 16, 17 onwards. As a history, 1995, we had substitution of old section 145, where the power to notify accounting standards was introduced. And immediately thereafter, the central government issued two accounting standards, AS1, which was similar to our AS1 and AS which are similar to our accounting standards. Thereafter, no further accounting standards were notified. In December 2010, CBDT constituted a committee for tax accounting standards. And this is important to be noted. Who constituted the committee? The CBDT who constituted the committee, not the Parliament, not the government. October 2012, formulation of 14 tax accounting standards. July 14, nomenclature was changed from tax accounting standards to ICDS. Because they said accounting standards would really mean that we are to maintain accounts according to these standards, and these standards are tax standards and therefore not applicable for maintenance of accounts, and therefore the nomenclature was changed from tax to ICDS. January 15, they released 12 draft accounting standards, or ICDS, and March 15, out of these 12, they notified 10. Who have been kept aside probably for being introduced a little later. To whom will these ICDS apply? It will apply to any SSE following mercantile system of accounting for the purpose of computing taxable income under the head business or profession or income from other sources. There are no criteria for in terms of turnover or net worth which are prescribed. So in other words, it will apply to every SSE for the purpose of computation of income under these two heads, every SSE. So in other words, say for example, salary earner getting income from the income value of interest from bank fixed deposits, and when he is not following cash system of accounting. In other words, he is offering his fixed deposit income to tax based on the certificate that he receives from his banker and the TDS certificate, although that interest is not related to his account, based on the approval certificate received from his banker, he is offering it for tax for a simple reason that I want my TDS to be matched along with my return, and therefore he offers that for tax. Technically, he is computing his income under the head income from other sources, following mercantile system of accounting, and therefore this accounting standards will apply. So it's just an extreme example that it will apply to the smallest of the small SSE and all other SSEs and for the purpose of computing income on their business and other sources. These accounting standards, these ICDS are not for the purpose of maintenance of books of account, and in case of a conflict between ICDS and the Act, the provisions of the Act shall prevail, and that is rightly so as we proceed going forward. What if ICDS is not complied with? If it is not complied with, we have 145.3, which empowers the assessing officer to make a best judgment assessment under 144. If he is not satisfied either about the correctness or completion of the account, or method of accounting is not regularly followed, or income is not computed as per ICDS. So this is the last third bullet point is also there in 145.3, which clearly shows, which clearly demonstrates what will happen in case you have not followed ICDS. The assessing officer will impose the provisions of ICDS. He will compute income by applying the provisions of ICDS, and he will make a best judgment assessment. So, prima facie, therefore, ICDS has to be mandatorily followed, or else best judgment assessment can be done by the assessing officer. With this background of the provisions of the Act, the notification has notified these 10 ICDS dealing with accounting policies, valuation of inventories, construction contracts, revenue recognition, tangible fixed assets, changes in foreign exchange rates, government grants, securities, borrowing costs, and provisions and contingent liabilities and contingent assets. The corresponding accounting standards and corresponding Ind AS are just noted in this table for the purpose of information. Now, so far, how have we been dealing with our returns of income? What are the principles followed by us for computation of income for the purpose of our return? It was a settled law that profits for tax purposes have to be computed in accordance with commercial accounting principles, unless there is something in the statute to the contrary. So, this particular principle well settled, several decisions of Supreme Court on this proposition, and we have a very specific observations in the decision of the Supreme Court in UP State Industrial Development Corporation, where they said, for the purpose of ascertaining profits and gains, the ordinary principles of commercial accounting should be applied, so long as they do not conflict with any express provision of the relevant statement. Going forward, what will happen? Going forward, for taxation purposes, the profits will have to be computed as per commercial accounting principles as modified by the provisions of ICDS. So, in other words, how would our computation look like? So far, we were saying profits as per profit and loss account, add less adjustments as per the provisions of the Act, and you would compute our total income. This was the general format of computation of income so far. Going forward, how will the computation look like? The computation will be something like this. We start with profits and gains from business operation as per our profit and loss account. Because ICDS, in the preamble, in each and every ICDS, we are told that the ICDS is not to be followed for the purpose of maintenance of accounts, it is only for the purpose of computation. So, in other words, our accounting profits remains as per our accounting standard. So, the starting point will certainly be the same. Profits and gains of business and profession as per the as computed as per the accounting standards and under the accounting principles. To this, before going to giving effect to the provisions of the Act, we will first give effect to the provisions of ICDS. So, add less adjustments as required by ICDS, which will give us some sort of an adjusted income. Because my accounting standards are inconsistent with the income computation standard, and therefore I first make an adjustments required under ICDS to bring my accounting profit in line with ICDS requirements. And thereafter, I make specific adjustments as required under the Act, all your allowances, disallowances, etc., and that is how I will compute my total income. So therefore, the difference between the way in which we were computing total income earlier and now is that before going into making the adjustments as per the Act, we first make an adjustments as required by ICDS so as to adjust our accounting profits. So therefore, then the question arises: can ICDS modify the basis of taxation either to upheld by tax court or cost generally? This is a basic question that arises. Because when the law said that accounting profit is the basis, unless something to the contrary stated in the Act. So therefore, accounting profits plus or minus the adjustments in the Act was my total income. And now we are adding something more, and that something more is added in accordance with or in order to comply with these provisions of ICDS, and therefore, can ICDS really modify the base of taxation is a question which we will just discuss. Now, as we saw, 145.2 is the genesis, is the basis on which the ICDS have been notified. Notified by the CBDT. 145.2 really gives powers to the central government to notify. But we find that the notification is issued by the CBDT. In law, there is a thin line of difference, but there is certainly a difference between the central government and the CBDT. But right now, we will not get into that aspect. Therefore, it is nothing but a delegated legislation. The Parliament has delegated its powers to legislate, and those powers have been delegated to CBDT. And CBDT, therefore, it is delegated to central government, and central government has therefore notified these standards. This being a delegated legislation, it will have to necessarily follow certain law laid down in respect of delegated legislation, and it is a central law that the notification cannot override the statute. It is supported by several decisions. I will cited two of them for our understanding. And therefore, we find that in the preamble to the ICDS, it has been clearly stated that in case of conflict between the provisions of the Act and the ICDS, the provisions of the Act shall prevail. So, it is very well recognized in every preamble of every ICDS that the provisions of the Act shall override. And therefore, the question arises, alright, this is the scope of delegated legislation. Now, therefore, what is the meaning of that adjustment that I have to make? When I start with the profit as for profit and loss account and I make adjustment as for the ICBS, what adjustment should I make? If it is inconsistent with the Act, then it should not apply. The adjustments which are given in the Act can only apply. How can there be any further adjustments which are notified by the CBDT or by the central government? How can it modify my taxable income? That's a basic question that I'm posing before the shortest audience. Can ICBS therefore bring to charge any item which is not in the nature of income, or which is not income as understood under the Act? And we find, as we go along, we find that there are some items where this something which can never be income is treated as income, or something which could have been income going forward is to be treated as income today. Coming to constitutional validity, yes, as I said, Indian system of governance has legislature, judiciary and executive, and legislation, the power of legislation which is with the parliament is delegated to the legislature and therefore it's a delegated legislation. Now, in case of any delegated powers, there are limitations. And what are the limitations of the delegated powers? And there is line of decisions, taking out decisions on this particular subject. There is a 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court which has said that while delegating powers of legislation to executive, the legislature must declare the policy of the law and the legal principles which are to control the given legislation and must provide a standard to guide the officials or body in power to execute it. The later decision which says the legislature has to lay down the policy and principle to afford guidance for carrying out the state policy before it delegates the subsidiary powers in that behalf. So what is the law for delegated legislation? There is a statute enacted by the Parliament. Parliament says that okay, certain powers have to be exercised by the executive, and what is the purpose of exercising that power? What is the policy framework? What is the guidelines? And the powers have to be exercised within that policy framework and guidelines. Now, when we look at section 145(2), do we get that policy? Do we get that guidelines? What does section 145(2) say? It only confers powers to the central government to notify income computation and disclosure standards. And it only says that it to be applied to such class of SSEs or such types of income as may be notified. So, okay, they said that it will apply to SSEs following organized system of accounting, to those class of SSEs. Those types of income, so you have several ICDS, the types of income could be construction contracts, service, sale of goods, etc. You apply to those types of income. That is fine. But where is the policy, where is the guidelines, where are the parameters required by these judicial authorities? Where are they in section 145? We don't find any. If you look at old section 145(3), which gave power to the assessing officer to reject my accounts, it said that I will reject your account. If the assessing officer has the power to reject the accounts, if the accounts are such that income cannot be properly reduced therefrom. So there was some parameter in that old section 145 that subject to these, the assessing officer can do this. Now, there's nothing over here at all. You don't find any parameters or any guidelines within which the central government has to notify these ICDS. And therefore, as a result of this, what has happened? As a result of this trend, what has happened is that we find, as we go along with this presentation, we'll find that there are certain provisions where certain item has been treated as my income which can never be treated as income at all. There are certain items of income which would be otherwise taxable as per the settled legal position. It would be taxable at a future point of time. You are preponing that time, that point of taxation, and this is how the ICDS has been actually framed in absence of any policy or guidelines found in the statute. And this gives rise to certain basic issues. Will ICDS be applicable? Okay. We'll get into that. Let's understand certain basic issues. Will ICDS be applicable for computing the minimum alternate tax liability? The answer is generally no, but there are certain illustrations that we will see a little later on that it may have impact on that. But because ICDS has not to be followed for the purpose of accounting, your MAT computation will really depend upon the profit and loss account as per your accounting standards. Yes, it will have impact to the extent of computation of your tax liability, your deferred tax liability, your current tax liability will be different, and therefore to that extent your book profits will be different, and therefore to that extent the MAT can get impacted. Whether ICDS would have any impact on the financial statements, so it may not have any impact except, as I said, for accounting standard 22, where you will give effect to timing differences, and that is where the impact can come. Will ICDS impact tax audits? As of today, we do not have any requirement of reporting, but after all, these are income computation and disclosure standards. These disclosures, where have to be made, there is no clarity. These disclosures will certainly have to be made in the return of income and not just the tax audit report, because as I said, this is not something which applies only to SSEs to whom tax audits apply. It applies to every small SSE also. There are no limitations on turnover or anything of that sort. So therefore, there will be amendments to the returns of income requiring you to say that the provisions of ICDS have been satisfied or not, and what adjustments are required under each of these ICDS. And I'm sure that will be the responsibility cast on the tax auditor also to report whether each and every ICDS has been complied with. But as of today, there is nothing which has been prescribed, so probably that we will discuss at a later point in time. Whether ICDS will apply in case of presumptive taxation. Presumptive taxation, you are not required to maintain your books of account, and there is no question of mercantile system versus cash system. Person who is not required to maintain the books of account, the provisions cannot really apply. However, question does arise as to where the presumptive taxation applies to SSC having a turnover below a certain limit. So how does one compute that turnover? Those questions will definitely come in. Should that turnover be computed as per the income recognition standard which has been prescribed, or it can be computed in any other manner? Those questions may arise, but by and large, for practical purposes, presumptive taxation SSCs may be following cash method, or may say that we are following cash method, and therefore can get away by not applying the provisions at all. And even if these provisions are applicable, they are applicable only for the purpose of computation of turnover. Beyond that, the provisions, in my mind, are not applicable at all. Now, let's get into the important aspects. I have not covered all. I have covered all the ICDS, but I have not covered all the aspects of ICDS, because by and large there are similarities between accounting standards and ICDS that have been notified. There are major areas of differences I have tried to highlight, and I have tried to highlight those areas of differences and the implications going forward from tax perspective. So ICDS 1, which really deals with accounting policies, and accounting standard recognizes the concept of prudence, and therefore expected losses are provided for, but expected gains are not accounted for or not recognized as per the accounting standards. The government does not like it. So when we look at the committee report, we find that to avoid the differential treatment of recognition of loss and income, the concept of prudence has been removed. So your ICDS 1 does not have this concept of prudence, which is there in your AS 1. If one looks at judicial decisions, there are several decisions based on the accounting principles based on the principle of prudence, etc. However, ICDS now tells us that prudence no more required. It doesn't say that in so many words, but the concept is gone. What it says in so many words is that the mark-to-market losses or the expected losses should not be recognized unless some other ICDS specifically allows you to recognize. So therefore, to that extent, your accounting standards are sought to be modified for the purpose of computation of your taxable income. In order to mitigate the impact of this, we may just keep in mind the difference between losses and expenses, because while the mark-to-market losses are not permissible, but expenditure is allowable if it otherwise complies with AS 29 or now ICDS 10, that you make a provision, and that provision, if it is otherwise allowable as a present obligation arising out of past event, and that provision is allowable. So, while mark-to-market losses may not be allowed, if there is a possibility of making a provision for an expense and not a loss, because loss and expenses are a different concept. That is what has been decided in several cases. And the basis of those decisions are expense is something which you incur out of volition, and loss is something which falls upon you, and there is no question of any volition over there. And so therefore, there being a legal difference between an expense and a loss, mark-to-market loss is not allowed, but however, in order to mitigate that, if you are in a position to make certain provision for expenses in accordance with AS 29 and now ICDS 10, then that would be allowed. So that's one of the mitigation aspects here. Another aspect is materiality concept has been done away. Accounting standard recognize materiality. If you look at the committee report, tax committee, say that the concept of materiality is not recognized in the Income Tax Act, we are removing it from the ICDS. ICDS does not have any specific provisions for materiality, and so therefore, what happens? Every small item has to be accounted, every small item will have to be recognized, not recognized, etc. However, if one reads the ICDS 1 as a whole, we find that in para 1, ICDS says it deals with significant accounting policies. So the concept of significant accounting policy is there. So concept of materiality does enter over here to some extent. Selection of accounting policy should be such that disclose a true and fair view. It does not talk about true and correct view. So therefore, once again, the concept of fairness is there. When the concept of fairness is there, materiality is inbuilt in it. There is a difference between something which is fair and something which is correct. So therefore, again, in the concept of fairness, the concept of materiality to my mind is inbuilt. For the change in accounting policy, they are saying that any change in accounting policy having material effect are to be disclosed. So, for disclosure purposes, material effect has to be seen even as per the ICDS Para 7 says so. So hence, even though the concept of materiality has not been expressly stated, it is implicit in some of the provisions of ICDS itself. But however, the difficulties will arise, especially in case of auditors and tax auditors, where either smaller items, technically speaking, a calculator is an item of office equipment and therefore plant and machinery and therefore should have been capitalized. But, rightly or wrongly, and probably wrongly, one would write it off as general business expenses or something. And because materiality was there in our tax audit guidance note, at times we didn't bother about these things. Now, if materiality is removed, to what extent you and I as tax auditors will have to go into the smallest of the small items of expenditure so as to report whether capital expenditure has been treated as revenue or not, is something which is going to create a great hardship. Then, what is reasonable cost? I think we do not get into that. Just keep it, otherwise we run out of time. ICDS 1. So, This is a larger question on ICTS 1. Is it a legislative misfire? And why am I saying so? The preamble says that ICTS is not for the purpose of maintenance of the account. But what does ICTS say? It talks about fundamental accounting assumptions, it talks about accounting policies, it talks about consideration in selection and change in accounting policies. So it talks entirely about accounting and accounting policies. But preamble says that this is not for the purpose of maintenance of principles. Is there an inconsistency in the two? And if there is an inconsistency, preamble would override the provisions. And therefore, this is a complete misfire, not relevant. That is one view of looking at it. But what's the intention? Intention is probably not that. Intention is that whatever accounting policy you are following, you follow that. If some accounting policies we do not agree with, then you make the adjustments as per this ICTS 1. So if you apply prudence, if you apply materiality, etc., if you claim up to market losses, then so be it in your accounts for the purpose of computation, you can't do it, you make an adjustment. So that's probably the intention. But the way in which the accounting standard is worded, it does not use negatives. It does not say that that these should not be followed. Materiality not to be considered. Prudence should not be considered. It only lays down policy. It does not say in so many words that in computing that this is for the purpose of computation of your income, that these accounting adjustments to be made. And therefore, the way in which it is worded, it seems that it is possible for someone to argue that this is only a legislative misfire. But anyway, that does not seem to be the intention of legislating ICTS 1. Coming to ICTS 2 on valuation of inventories. Now, one of the major aspects of this ICTS 2 is the treatment of distribution costs, for example, transportation costs of a branch transfer. The accounting standard says that when you compute your cost of inventory, the selling and distribution expenses are to be excluded. The ICTS says that only selling expenses are to be excluded. So the word and distribution is not there. So the question arises whether distribution cost is to be excluded or not to be excluded. Should it be included? Is the question. Now, to my mind, though, it looks a big issue, but it is not. Because if one looks at the ESC opinions, which were rendered in the context of accounting standards, we find that it has been clarified that the inventory cost should include all costs that are incurred to bring the inventory to its present location and condition. And so, therefore, transportation costs of bringing the goods from your point of manufacture to your point of sale has to be included, because that is the cost incurred to bring that stock to the present location and condition. So that has to be included in the inventory cost. And once from the selling point to the customer, there is a sale which has happened, and therefore there is no question of including that cost. The sale has happened, there is no stock. Now, this ESC opinion has said in the context of the accounting standards, which say that selling and distribution costs have to be excluded. So, therefore, for all practical purposes, the word and distribution has no meaning. And distribution is really in the nature of selling expenses, and the cost of branch transfer anyway under your accounting standards have to be included even today, and going forward for ICTS also it will have to be included as part of the cost. So removal of the word and distribution to my mind really does not make any difference. Whether ICTS will be applicable to service providers. The accounting standard very clearly says the working progress of service provider has been excluded from the scope. When you look at the committee report, it says the method of valuation of inventory of a service provider based on international best practices has to be incorporated. So therefore, they removed that exclusion part. From the, exclusion from the scope was removed. So in other words, the working progress of a service provider is intended to be included for the purpose of ICTS 2. However, if one looks at the definition of inventories, it says inventories are assets that are held for sale in the ordinary course of business, in the process of production or for sale, and in the form of materials or supplies to be consumed in the production or process or in rendering of services. So far as services are concerned, only the inventories in the form of material or supplies to be consumed in the form for the purpose of rendering services. Just to be that. The word inventory is not wide enough to cover the work in progress of a service provider. And therefore, that being the definition of inventory, nothing can enter the cost of inventory. Although the committee report says so, although from the scope they have, or exclusion part of the scope they have removed it, it has no real consequence. The other aspect is that the inventories for a service in case of a service provider, your ICDS on revenue recognition says that the service provider has to follow the completed or the percentage completion method. Now, if a service provider has to follow percentage completion method, the inventory valuation is implicit in the way in which you offer your profits for completion of the to the extent of the percentage completion of the project or service. So, if you are offering your income under ICDS based on percentage completion, there is no separate valuation of work in progress because the valuation of work in progress is implicit in the profits that you compute under the percentage completion method. So, therefore, for all practical purposes, this question is very academic in nature. You and I as service providers, this ICDS does not apply to us because we will follow a cash method of account. But other service providers, this question may apparently look relevant. But if they have to follow percentage completion method, the valuation of work in progress is embedded in that itself. Whether inventory is to be evaluated NRV in the case of dissolution. Now, this is one of the major items of amendment that is sought to be made by ICDS. It's a backdoor amendment to the Act, and this is something which one will have to consider in the light of what we discussed earlier. That can something which is not in the nature of income at all be introduced as income by ICDS? I'll just give a small background. When a firm dissolves, question arose whether the valuation of inventory should be made at cost to market value, which is lower, or should it be valued at the market price. The department said, I'm talking about something relating that the Supreme Court decision mentioned on there, 250 ITR 870. The department said that look, there is a dissolution of a firm, and the concept of cost of market value, which is lower, can apply only to a going concern. It cannot apply to a concern which is dissolved. The Supreme Court, after elaborate discussion of various case laws on the subject, took a view that in that particular case, although the firm was dissolved, the business was continued by somebody else, by one of the partners who took over the business. And so therefore it took a view that the business is not discontinued. The firm has been dissolved, but the business continues. If the business continues, this concept of cost of market value, whichever is lower, will still apply. This is Supreme Court decision. And therefore, there is no question of valuing inventory for the purpose of calculating of the profits of the firm which is dissolved. You don't value inventory at market price. This probably the government does not like. Now here there is a specific provision in ICDS 2 to say that the inventory of a dissolved firm will have to be valued at market price irrespective of whether the business continues or does not continue. Straight attack on the decision of the Supreme Court was to nullify the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court. So therefore, then the question arises, can this be done by a delegated legislation? Is this legislation really valid, or it is something which can be challenged as unconscious or as ultra-virus the provisions of the Act? The Supreme Court has interpreted a particular method of valuation. Now it is again, if you go into the history of your decision of the Supreme Court in Chendu Sampatram, it says that valuation by itself can never bring about any profits. So valuation is a matching principle. You don't bring about any profits by virtue of valuation. So therefore, a valuation cannot create a profit is what Supreme Court is saying. No income accrues in that sense. What is therefore Supreme Court has said. Now the ICD has said, not the Parliament friends, it is the CBDT who now says that there will be an income accrual in the hands of the firm, irrespective of whether the business continues or not. And the question here is, can this provision stand the test of validity, or is it really ultra vires the provisions of the Act? Can the CBDT say something in ICDS so as to nullify the effect of the decision of the Supreme Court? To my mind, no. I'm just giving this question to scholars. I'm jumping onto ICDS 8 because this also deals with valuation of inventory, valuation of stock, not the stock of goods as we understand, but the stock of securities. And what is the major impact of this ICDS 8? For valuation of stock of securities, the accounting standard provides for a line-by-line comparison. So, say for example, I have securities of 4 companies, company P, Q, R, and S. The cost is 150, 150, 150 each, and the net realizable values are given there, and therefore the difference between the two, for the purpose of our accounting standard, I will look at line by line. And I will say the first item, cost of market value, which is lowest for 20, cost of market value, which is lowest for 45, 15, and 150. This is how I will value for the purpose of accounting standard. Therefore, I will come at a total valuation of 230. Whereas, ICDS now says that you have to look at the category of the investments that you have made. So you have to bunch all shares together, all debentures together, all bonds together, etc. etc. Category wise you will have to see. And for each category, aggregate cost versus aggregate market value you will see. So therefore, my aggregate is 600 and aggregate of NRV is 380. So whichever is lower is 380. So for ICDS purpose, my valuation of inventory or my valuation of stock of the securities will be 380, whereas under accounting standards it would be 230. So as a result of ICDS, probably I will have to offer this much income more. Now, the question arises, what is the impact of section 145 capital A? Now here we deal with ICDS 2 and 8 both. When I find that I am in trouble because of ICDS, I have to find some solution to that. What is the solution? A probable solution is answer is lying in the Act itself. 145A, 145A says what? Your ICDS is under 145, 145(2). And 145A says notwithstanding anything to the contrary containing 145. So 145A overrides 145. So 145A overrides ICDS. It says notwithstanding anything to the contrary containing 145, the valuation of purchase and sale of goods and inventory for the purpose of determining the income chargeable and the profits of business shall be in accordance with the method of accounting regularly employed by the SSC, and you will only make adjustments for tax, duty, cess, etc., mortgage, standard, etc. Those adjustments you make. We are not concerned with those adjustments right now, but what it essentially says is that the valuation of inventory, purchase and sale of goods and inventory, so therefore inventory also is of goods, obviously. And securities are goods under the Sale of Goods Act. They are movable property and therefore they are goods. So therefore, valuation of inventory, whether it be security or any other inventory, has to be done in accordance with the method of accounting regularly followed by the SEC. So I will do that, and I will make adjustments as required under 145A. Where is 145 in picture? Where is ICDS in picture? Complete bypass. And leave it as a food for thought. But if we are in trouble. I think this is presently a solution available to us. Then, that takes us to ICBS 3 on construction. And on construction contracts, the question arises as to the applicability of ICBS 3 to a real estate developer. Our accounting standard 7, the earlier accounting standard clearly said that the statement also applies to enterprises undertaking construction activity to the type dealt with in this statement not as contractors but on their own account as a venture of commercial nature where the enterprise will enter into agreement to sale. So, no dispute, old accounting standards applied not only to contractors but also to bidders. Accounting Standard 2002 says that this standard should be applied in accounting for construction contracts in the financial statements of contractors. And therefore, we had guidance note as to applicability of AS7 related to AS9, etc., etc. AS7 as it stands today by itself does not apply to bidder; it applies read with AS9. What does ICBS say? This income computation and disclosure standard should be applied in determination of income for a construction contract of a contractor. So, construction contract of a contractor is the scope of ICBS, and the construction contract has been defined, and it does not include anywhere. It's very clear that it is for the purpose of construction contract, the contract negotiated for the purpose of construction or destruction of an asset. And therefore, it clearly does not apply to a person who is doing business on its own, and therefore it does not apply to a real estate developer doing its own construction work. If you look at the committee report says that the committee recommends that the tasks covering the following areas may also be considered for notification under the Act, and one of the areas which is said was revenue recognition by real estate developers. So when they give a draft of ICBS or TAS for construction contracts, they said that the following areas may also have to be covered, and there they said real estate developers, and therefore by implication, this ICBS is not even intended by the committee to cover the real estate developers. But doubts are arisen because of the decision of the Supreme Court in Larsen & Toubro's case, where, having regard to the provisions of the Constitution and the provisions of the Karnataka and Maharashtra VAT law, sales tax law, where the Supreme Court decided that when a builder constructs flats and sells these flats in the course of construction, the sale of flats in the course of construction amounts to works contract. And this decision came not only based on the local law, but the domestic law of sales tax law of Maharashtra and Karnataka, but also having regard to the article dealing with works contract in the Constitution. So therefore, serious doubt arose as to whether, when Supreme Court in Larsen & Toubro has interpreted the term works contract in a particular manner, can the construction contract in ICBS be interpreted in a different manner? First of all, of course, the words used are not works contract, it's construction contract. So to that extent, there is the same concept or the same nomenclature has not been used. But interestingly, in the context of Income Tax Act, this very provision was sought to be, or this very decision rather, was sought to be applied by the tax department in an ATIB case, where ATIB is not available to a contractor or to a person who is just carrying out works contract, and this provision was sought to be applied by the department, and the matter reached the Gujarat High Court, and Gujarat High Court said that look, that Larsen & Toubro decision was rendered in context of another law, and having regard to the language of the sales tax law in Karnataka and Maharashtra, it has got nothing to do with the income tax law, and therefore we will not apply we will not apply that law to the provisions of income tax. Now that being the view of the judiciary on the subject, I don't think that there remains any doubt on this particular issue. And therefore, my mind is very clear at this point of time that the provisions of ICGS3 cannot apply to the estate. Another aspect of ICGS3, whether retention money would be taxable on the stage of completion basis. You see, in any construction contract or any long-term contract, you have provisions for retaining certain money, retention money. So, if you don't pay the whole amount, although the entire work is done, you retain certain portion, and then you release that portion to the contractor only after certain conditions are fulfilled or certain time period is over. The courts have held in several cases, at least 6 High Court decisions, including Gujarat, Karnataka, where the view has been taken that retention money is not accrual of income. The principle which has been followed is the principle laid down by the Supreme Court in E. Sasu's case as to what is accrual. And accrual really means a right to receive. I should have done part of my duty and I should have earned that, number one. And there should be a liability of the other side to pay me. I should have done my work. There should have been a liability on the other side. Then only there is an accrual. Otherwise, there is no accrual. That is what principle laid down by the Supreme Court in E. Sasu. That principle applied in the case of retention money. The courts have held consistently that retention money is not income accrued because there is no right to receive that income. There is no liability on the other side to pay you unless and until you satisfy certain conditions. Now, in ICDS, they want to change that position. Committee report says, in order to overcome unintended meaning given by judicial pronouncement, we would now include retention money as part of contract revenues. And they will define contract revenues so as to include retention money specifically. Accounting standard does not say anything about it. But here ICDS specifically includes retention money also when they define what is contract revenues. So in order to overcome unintended meaning given by judicial pronouncement, the committee sitting on judgment rendered by 6 high courts of the country and followed by conveniently followed by civility, and therefore civility is really trying to nullify these decisions of the high court. So once again we come back to the question, if not Supreme Court but these 6 high courts have held that something is not income accrued, can the civility change that position, or is it necessary that the Parliament should amend the law? Can such an amendment be a part of a delegated legislation at all? And if not, can this be a point of challenge of ICDS as being ultra virus? Next point on ICDS, the absence of specific provision in ICDS whether expected losses on construction contract can still be claimed. The accounting standard says expected losses are allowed. This is based on the principle of prudence. The committee report says that to remove differential treatment of income and losses. We don't recognize this concept of prudence. Judicial pronouncement on expected losses. We have a decision of Delhi High Court in Triveni Engineering. We also have Gujarat High Court in Advanced Construction, where they have said that having regard to the principles of accounting in the accounting standards, if there is an expected future loss, if there is a foreseeable loss, that's what AS7 says, if there is a foreseeable loss, then that foreseeable loss for a contract is allowable. The entire loss, if you say that my contract is complete at 70%, but at the end of the project, I expect that the entire project will be at a loss. So accounting standards permits you to debit the foreseeable loss today, and that is based on the principle of prudence. And our high courts have approved that, having regard to the concept of prudence. Now prudence has been removed, and therefore, can you say that having prudence been removed, this is a position which has been taken by the CBDT that prudence is removed and therefore foreseeable losses will not allow. We will allow only the losses which are accrued up to the stage of completion, And beyond the stage of completion, and then when the losses accrue, we will allow. Well, prima facie such loss won't be allowed. However, if it is concluded that ICDS 1 is a legislative misfire, which we just discussed, then relying on commercial accounting principles, the loss should be allowed. Whether the provision for an expense can be made or not under ICDS 10, so that is another point of mitigation of difficulty. That fine foreseeable losses may not be allowed. But if today you are in a position to provide for certain expenses, if you have those contracts in place and you are able to make provision for the expenses, then you are not making provision for foreseeable losses, you make provision for the expenses which AS 10 or AS 29 or ICDS 10 still allows you to take. So that's a mitigation point, but otherwise ICDS does overturn or nullify the impact of these decisions of the High Court. Implication of non-allowance of expected losses. And here we worked out an example. Expected loss. We have year 1 to 3 book profits, and we have profit as per income tax. So, because of those foreseeable losses in year 1, say for example, I book a loss of 300 because I am allowed foreseeable losses. And at the end of year 3, I find that ultimately my loss is not 300 but only 240, so therefore 60 I book as income in the third year. So as per the law as it stands today, you are allowed 300 in the first year and you will be taxed on 60 in the third year. Now going forward, we are told that no, you will be allowed only to the extent you are actually incurring the losses. So therefore, for the tax purposes, having regard to this ICDS, I will claim only, say for example, 100, 140. This is how I will claim in the tax returns for the 3 years. So what has happened? I don't pay tax under the normal provisions of the Act, but when it comes to MAT, what happens? In the first year there is a loss of 300, second year nothing, third year there is a profit of 60. And that profit of 60, I may have to pay MAT on that unless I am able to set off loss or depreciation whichever is lower. If I am able to set that off, fine. But if I am not able to set off loss or depreciation whichever is lower, then I will end up paying tax on that 60 in the third year, whereas in the contract actually I have incurred a loss of 240. So this is another anomaly which arises out of this particular provision, and therefore either one will have to necessarily fall in line with the ICDS and not to have separate, not to follow accounting standards and provide for foreseeable losses, although the accounting standards require. Now, if you do that, I am not sure as to what the statutory auditor will do. And probably the statutory auditor will have to qualify that these foreseeable losses are there and it has not been accounted for. That takes us to ICDS 4 on revenue recognition. Whether ICDS 4 has an impact on finance lease, answer is no. Although the scope of ICDS 4 is sale of goods, rendering of services and use of resources by others, but the use of resources only to the extent of yielding interest, royalty and dividend, and it does not deal with use of resources by way of letting out of movable or immovable property, and therefore leases or rentals are not sought to be covered by ICDS 4. Whether ICDS will have any impact on revenue recognition of export incentives. Now, interestingly, so far as export incentives are concerned, here the decision of Supreme Court in Excel Industries, which said that look, there is an export which has been made. Based on my export performance, I am entitled to certain export incentives. So I make a claim for export incentives. After the stage of making the claim, certain export incentives in terms of, say, advanced licenses. So I get licenses to import duty free. I am allotted those licenses. So the claims are passed and I am allotted those licenses. After the licenses are allotted, I may use it for import or I may not use it for import, and if the time lapses, I may not use it at all, and therefore I will not gain anything out of it. So the question arose in Excel industry is at what point of time is this export incentive taxable? The department wanted to tax it at the time when the export was made. Supreme Court said that when you have actually utilized it for the purpose of import, the export incentives would be taxable at that stage. So the income accrues at that point of time. That is what Supreme Court said in Excel industry. Now, what does ICDS say? Interestingly, ICDS deals with this in para 5, and in para 5 it says that at the time of making the claim for export incentives, if there is an uncertainty, then you don't account for it. So therefore, by implication, if at the time of making the claim, if there is no reasonable uncertainty, should I offer it for tax? At the time of making the claim, if there is an uncertainty, I don't offer. Otherwise, does it mean that I have to offer for tax? That is what comes out from a plain reading of paragraph 5 of ICDS 4. And if that is the way in which this has to be interpreted, once again the question arises. We come back to those fundamental questions that we raised at the beginning. That can ICDS override the concept of accrual as explained by the courts? In my mind, it cannot. And if it cannot, then is this also one of the points whereby this particular legislation can be challenged? Implication of following project completion method for books of account. So ICDS 4 on revenue recognition for services, our accounting standard permits services to be income from services to be recognized on either of the two methods, project completion or percentage completion. However, ICDS does not like project completion, so therefore percentage completion is a must. So therefore, what are the implications there? Once again, somewhat similar to what we just saw earlier. Year 1 to 3, income tax 100, 100, books of account. If I am following percentage, if I am following project completion, in the third year in the books of account, I will record the entire profit of 300. But because of percentage completion, I have offered 100, 100 for tax in 3 years. And therefore, I have paid tax under normal provisions of the Act 30-30-30. But in the last year, because I have book profits, I will end up paying tax on the entire 300 in the last year, because 18.5% of 300 is more than the 30 rupee of tax, and therefore I will end up paying MAT in the last year on book profits. So I have paid tax on the normal provision in the first 2 years, MAT in the other year, in the last year, and that is how I will end up paying some extra tax because of distribution. So therefore, I will compulsorily fall in line with the ICDS, not to follow the accounting standard, which permits me two separate accounting methods. Another aspect is interest. ICDS 4, revenue recognition, insofar as it relates to interest, discounts and premium, we are told that the interest, discounts and premium has to be recognized on time basis. What are the case laws on the subject so far? Suppose I am holding a security and I am entitled to interest on securities twice in a year, one on 31st December and the other on 30th of June. I am on 31st of March making my balance sheet. I have earned my interest last up to 31st of December. My next interest will be due on 30th of June. The question arises whether the interest for the period 1st January to 30th June is that taxable or is it not taxable. Based on the principle once again of the Sasun, no right to receive. What's ahead that interest is not taxable, that interest will be taxable only when you have right to receive, and that is on 30th of June, and therefore this interest is not taxable in your hand. That concept of accrual now seems to have been done away with, and we are told that interest, premiums and discount have to be offered on time basis. Again, coming back to the same question, can ICDS override the law laid down by Supreme Court in E.D. Sasun, and that principle being followed by various decisions on various aspects. Another aspect, Godra is real income theory. You have non-performing assets, say for example an NBFC. Here banks will not be very much affected because banks insofar as it relates to accounting for interest on NPA, there is a specific provision in section 43D where the banks have to follow and which is more or less in line with their RBI guideline. There are some minor differences, but we may not get into that. So section 43D enables banks to not account for interest on NPAs if it is in line with the RBI prudential norms by and large. But insofar as non-banking financial companies are concerned, question arises if they have NPAs, then on those non-performing assets where there is real uncertainty of recovery of the final of the principal amount itself, should the interest be recognized? Should it be offered to tax? And these sort of questions give rise to the theory of real income, and the courts consistently have held that. So when there is grave doubt of principle itself, there is a question of recognizing interest, and that interest can never be taxed. This is not an accrual where understood under the law, the income does not accrue. Now we are told in ICBS that interest, discounts, and premium have to be recognized on a time basis. Another thing, under accounting standard, we have the concept that if there is an uncertainty of ultimate collection and receipt, you don't recognize revenue. A sign is very clear on that. A paragraph dedicated to that. In the ICBS, this uncertainty theory is there. It is there so far as it relates to sale of goods. It is there insofar as it relates to construction contracts, to service contracts, because service contracts follows the construction contract accounting standard ICBS and ICBS over there. But when it comes to interest, dividend, etc., the concept of uncertainty is not found in ICBS at all. So, on a plain reading, unless you stretch your imagination and say that, okay, this particular paragraph applies to all sorts of income under the ICBS, it's very difficult to read it that way. The uncertainty concept in the ICBS on a plain reading appears to apply only to sale of goods and to those construction or service contracts, but it does not apply to interest, dividend, etc. And therefore, if that is the view which can be taken on a plain reading of ICBS, does it mean that the real income theory goes out of the window? And therefore, the concept of accrual, as understood by the Supreme Court in Godrej Electricity, etc., are now once again overdone, and therefore, once again, the same question: can ICBS, can central government, can CBDT really do that? Coming to ICBS 5 on tangible fixed assets. ICBS 5 there's nothing much to deal with the first bullet point. Accounting standard provides that in case there is a significant delay between the period when the plant is ready for commercial production and the actual commencement of commercial production, the expenditure during such period can also be treated as revenue expenditure. However, in absence of such specific clause in the ICBS, even such expenditure would need to be capitalized. So that interim period between the period of ready for commercial production and actual commercial production, the expenses would then have to be capitalized, which otherwise under the accounting standards you were allowed to write it off as revenue. Otherwise, these are small points of difference, nothing much to discuss on that. But the question once again arises, is ICBS 5 really required? Because so far as depreciation is concerned, it says that it will be governed by section 32. Depreciation is on actual cost. Actual cost has been defined in section 43(1). The term actual cost has been interpreted by the Supreme Court in Chandrakani Sugar to say that actual cost of an asset means an actual cost as understood under commercial accounting principles. So, having regard to that decision of Supreme Court, can actual cost now be changed by ICBS in whatever manner, whether that period of interregnum or whatever it is, can it be changed? So, therefore, can I not argue that the actual cost is defined in 43. One, is there something which is there in the Act as interpreted by the Supreme Court, and therefore ICBS 5 is something which is required or not required at all. 12. Effects of changes in foreign exchange. And let me make this one aspect, which is again a glaring aspect of this particular ICDS. Say for example, I have a branch abroad, which was set up 20 years back. I purchased property for that branch at the time when the dollar was say 40 rupees. And I consolidated branch accounts in my accounts. When you go to the accounting standard, it says that all the non-monetary items, so that asset which I am holding, that property which I am holding abroad, is a non-monetary item. So non-monetary item of such a branch has to be reported, has to be accounted for at the prevailing foreign exchange rate as of today, but the difference has to be transferred to the reserve account. So I don't account for that difference under the accounting standard to a profit and loss account, and rightly so, it is only an information and therefore it appears as some reserve. ICDS says that that difference has to be recognized as income or loss. So if I had acquired a property at the time when the dollar was 40, today it is 60, so in the first year I will account for that fixed assets in my consolidated accounts of India at 60 rupees, and at that difference of 20 I have to offer it as income following this ICDS. Now certainly by no stretch of imagination can this be regarded as income at all. It is not income as understood under the Constitution of India. It is not income as defined in section 224 of the Income Tax Act. By no stretch of imagination this is income. This is only a notional appreciation. And accounting standard requires, therefore accounting standard requires you to account for that difference in the reserve. But here you are told that you will have to pay tax on that. So therefore once again, can ICDS ever do this? Can CBDT ever do this? Is it within the powers? Can they go beyond the statute, tax something as income which can never be regarded? When it comes to government grants, they have amended the section 224 to include all types of subsidy within the provisions of income, within the definition of income. And interestingly, if you read the Finance Minister's speech when he introduced this amendment in Finance Act 2015, and the last moment this was introduced. If you read his speech, we are told that this amendment is made in order to bring the Act in line with the ICDS. So you amend this Act, ICDS was announced earlier because the draft came earlier in March, and later on we are told that we are amending the Act in order to bring it in line with ICDS. So you amend the Act in law. So now therefore the position of the government grant is that all types of subsidies etc. is going to be taxed. If it is revenue, it was always taxed. If it was capital, two questions arose. Is it related to a specific capital asset? If it is related to capital asset, then you release from the cost. That position remains. So the cost of the asset, to the extent the subsidy is related to a specific fixed asset, then it will be reduced from the cost. That position remains even under ICDS. But there used to be other types of subsidies which are capital in nature and not to be reduced from the cost, and backward area subsidies etc. Not to be reduced from the cost, and capital receipt not chargeable to tax. That position is gone. Either you reduce from the cost or offer it as income full stop. However, so here there is an amendment in the Act itself. It's very difficult to challenge unless you challenge the Act itself and say that under the Act you can't treat something as income which cannot be income. But that seems to be very difficult. Be that as it may, now there are two types of subsidies which we have identified that this provision, neither this amendment nor the ICDS will apply. One is the type of carbon credits. Carbon credits have been considered as capital receipts by Andhra Pradesh High Court in 369 India, and prepayment of sales tax deferral loan. Question arose whether such prepayment gives rise to section 41 non-tax, and the court said that there is no benefit and therefore it's not taxable. And so these two types are not covered within the amendment that has been made in the Act, nor is it covered under the ICDS. So barring these two, I don't think of any other subsidies which remain outside the scope of the amendment and the thing. Other points for ICS 7 not very major. ICS 8 we already did. And just 2-3 minutes on borrowing costs before we end. A16 on borrowing costs, we are aware that there should be a qualifying asset, and if that qualifying asset, if there is any interest attributable to that qualifying asset, that has to be capitalized. That position is here in ICS 9. The part that we need that discussion today is, if there is a specific borrowing related to a particular asset, then that interest on the specific borrowing will be capitalized till the time it is put to use. So we have said, what is the commencement of capitalization? Either the date of borrowing or date of utilization of funds related to the general borrowing. And when do you cease capitalization? You cease capitalization when the fixed asset is put to use. And if it is inventory of say real estate, because qualifying asset would also include inventory of real estate because it takes a longer period of time. So there substantially all the activities are completed. So commencement of capitalization, cessation of capitalization. However, if the interest is not specific to that particular asset, but if you have used certain general borrowings for the purpose of acquiring the asset, then accounting standards provides for a proper scientific formula. It has a period multiplier and your method in which you apportion a portion of the interest and capitalize it. In ICDS, probably for purpose of simplification of what I don't know, they got this formula A into B upon C, the formula of rule 8D. They have brought it over here. And this A into B upon C has created so many litigation in 14A, and it will create litigation over here also. And here we are told that A is the borrowing cost other than specific borrowings. B upon C, B is the average of the assets at the beginning of the year and end of the year. That is the numerator. The aggregate, the average of the fixed assets, the qualifying assets, at the beginning of the year and end of the year. And denominator C is the average of the total assets, not just the qualifying assets, but the total assets at the end of the year. Opening and closing average of that. So this formula says what? Entire year's interest. Numerator, all qualifying assets. Denominator, all assets. So qualifying assets are the assets which have taken significant time for its development. I may have qualifying assets which have been installed, put to use in the past. So does it mean that I have to include the interest attributable to even that? The answer is no, because this formula has to be read alongside the other provision that we just saw, that when should you commence the capitalization, when should you cease the capitalization. So if there is a qualifying asset which has been acquired out of borrowed money in the past, then that will not form part of your numerator for the purpose of capitalization. Because the formula by itself does not say that, but that formula will have to be read with these two paragraphs of commencement of capitalization and cessation of capitalization. However, there is no pro rata formula given. There is no period aspect inbuilt in this formula. So your interest is for the entire year. Your numerator is for the qualifying assets. Your denominator is the total assets. But for what period? This formula does not do that. So therefore, we have to go by the period of commencement and cessation. However, that commencement and cessation, there may be the interest actually utilized or borrowed fund actually utilized for that period to be completely different from this particular formula. So if I have utilized the overdraft for a period of 1 month, then the entire year's interest prorated in this manner into 1 upon 12 would probably become my capitalization. So all that I am saying is that the formula given here is, no doubt it is trying to simplify the things, but it will be completely different from the from your accounting formula or scientifically determined interest cost to be capitalized. And this may work both ways, and if there are absurd results, then once again this may be an aspect to be challenged. Another aspect for inventory of real estate, whether general borrowing cost should be attributed to cost of inventory of real estate. So A to Q upon C should it be applied to inventory of real estate? Reading ICDS on a standalone basis, it is a qualifying asset and you have to do it. But we cannot override the Act. What does the Act say? Act allows you interest under 36(1)(3). 36(1)(3) says that the amount of interest paid in respect of capital borrowed for the purpose of business is available. And there is a proviso. And proviso says that the amount of interest paid in respect of capital borrowed for acquisition of an asset for any period beginning from the date on which the capital was borrowed for acquisition of that till the date on which such asset was first put to use will have to be capitalized. Now, what is contemplated under 36(1)(3) main provision is any interest is allowable for the purpose under 36(1)(3) as business expenditure, so long as it is for the purpose of business. Therefore, we have Bombay High Court in Lokhandwala to say that if a real estate developer has interest cost, then it is a stocking trade. You cannot capitalize the interest on stocking trade, and therefore the interest has to be allowed under 36(1)(3). You cannot capitalize as part of a stocking trade. Proviso says that from the date on which you utilize the fund or you borrowed the funds till the asset is put to use your capital. So therefore, proviso intends to cover assets which are intended to be put to use. It does not cover assets which are intended to be sold. So having regard to the language of the proviso, although it says asset, it does not say capital asset. But because it says it uses a phrase put to use. So the period of capitalization is the period from borrowing to the time you have put to use. Because the concept of put to use is there, it is very evident that the proviso would apply only in case of a capital asset which is meant for put to use and not a stocking trade which is meant for sale, and therefore proviso cannot apply to stocking trade. And if that is so, if that is right interpretation, then therefore the impact of ICDS allocating this general borrowing in A into B upon C, although it is a qualifying asset, but because proviso does not require you to capitalize it, and 36(1)(3) by itself says that any interest is allowable if it is for the purpose of business, in my mind it should still be allowable and ICDS cannot affect it. ICDS 10 provision for contingencies, there is nothing much in that except in case of onerous contracts. We are told accounting standard makes a provision that if an enterprise has a contract that is onerous, the present obligation under the contract is recognized and measured as a provision. ICDS 10 does not deal with onerous contracts, and therefore by this there is no other major change between ICDS 10 and AS 29. All your provision for warranties, etc., which were otherwise allowable for tax purposes having regard to the decision of Supreme Court in controls, etc., would continue to be allowable even under ICDS 10, and there is no major change here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yogesh Bhai. We have completely run out of time, like they say on the television, and we won't have time for any further questions. I think it seems like it's not income tax it's not income computation, but it more looks like income tax correction type of standards. And I'll straight away request Ganesh Rai Gopalan to propose a very happy vote of thanks and request you all to just remain seated for 1 more minute as a mark of courtesy.
Good evening. First of all, announcements. The next testimony is on the 16th September by Mr. Ketan Dalal. He could address his thoughts on how to holistically address clients on aspects of on tax aspects. Basically, the title of his talk is going to be tax and structuring the big picture. So, request you all to come and attend and attend the registry. As far as last 1.5 hours goes, you have come to know prudence is not required any further. Materiality you can put it out the window and embrace uncertainty so long as it fetches more taxes for the government. It's a scary picture considering what the results will be. We should thank Mr. Thar, for admirably taking us through all the ICDs which have been notified in the last one and a quarter hours, and taking us through the differences between the ICDs and the accounting standards, the nuances. And I request you all to carry our thanks with a loud applause. Thank you.
I must congratulate you on a lovely page. Where do you get the data that you have collected so much? Collected so much data. Where do you get it?